One of the most common challenges I see for clients in therapy is family conflict. So this could be anything from a brother, child, or a parent getting in arguments, and it could be someone you live with, it could be someone that you see only once in a while. But one version or another seems to present itself maybe more often than we'd like. So what do I do if I'm dealing with family conflict? One of the most effective tools I've found is setting and holding boundaries effectively. One of the things that is not helpful is setting boundaries ineffectively, and that can actually lead to more conflict and more challenges than were there before we even attempted to set the boundaries. So it's important to go over the differences between setting boundaries effectively and setting boundaries in a way that's actually going to make things worse. So that's what we're going to learn in this video, is what to do when we're setting boundaries and holding boundaries, and what not to do to avoid making the situation even more challenging. So what is a boundary? A boundary is essentially the limit of what we're okay with and what we're not okay with in a relationship. And we know that a boundary has been crossed if the feelings start to get really uncomfortable, or if it feels like something that we're not willing to tolerate in an ongoing relationship, if it was going to be there every day, for example. What are my boundaries? What are the boundaries that I uniquely have and that I might benefit from communicating? The best place to look for this is at the emotions we commonly experience with our family. So if every time I go to mom and dad's house, they talk about who I'm dating and that feels really uncomfortable, or if every time I go to my brother's house, he's talking about my career and, what I chose to do for a living, and that feels really uncomfortable. These are telltale signs that maybe a boundary is being crossed if we're feeling those unpleasant emotions and it feels like it's taxing the relationship with our family member. So what do we do? There's a few things to keep in mind when it comes to setting boundaries. One is it should be a planned conversation. The chances for success in this conversation are much higher if we can do this in a way that's planned. If the conversation happens on the spur of the moment, in the midst of a conflict especially, chances of it going well are slim to none. So what we want to do is take note when we notice a boundary is being crossed and schedule a conversation. So this can be done in the moment, saying, hey, I'd love to have a chat with you, next weekend, if that's okay. Or it could be done, via text or a phone call at a later time set up. And that's probably the safer of the two, because then we don't have to worry about them saying, well, what do you want to talk about? And then getting sucked into the conversation right away. What's important when that conversation does happen? One thing that's important is that everyone's in at least a calm mood, ideally a good mood. If either of those is the case, then we have kind of the foundation conditions for that conversation to happen effectively. We've planned it, everyone's in a good mood, and we can address this without getting triggered and without going into fight or flight, hopefully. Okay, so we have the ground rules in terms of what type of mood, that it's planned ahead of time. Now what? Well, now we have to actually communicate the boundary. And that is usually best done through an I feel statement or something similar, where we're keeping the focus just on us and on our feelings and what each scenario is going to lead to when we talk about a boundary being crossed or not being crossed. So let's get more specific. If I have a brother who's constantly criticizing who I date, and I tell him, hey brother, I'm feeling a little uncomfortable with some of the comments around who I'm dating, and I'm just realizing that if that were to keep happening, I would probably get defensive and it would lead to arguments, and I really don't think that would be a helpful trend to continue in the relationship. So would you mind just steering clear of talking about who I'm dating and how you feel about it? There we made very intentional use of just discussing our feelings and not using any kind of judgment or criticism of what he's doing. A more common way that people communicate in situations like this is, why do you always criticize who I'm dating? It's so stupid. I wish you just would shut up about that, right? That's maybe a little more common, and this is why relationships with family are often strained, because those kind of comments you might be able to imagine are going to get more defensiveness and more escalation, and the conflict's just going to grow from there. So if we keep it focused on us, it allows for all the conditions necessary for our family member to best be able to empathize with us and be able to kind of feel what our perspective is and not feel attacked. As soon as we feel attacked, typically we get defensive. And that is going into fight or flight. That's going into survival instincts. And survival instincts are not warm and fuzzy. They're fighting for survival, right? So we definitely want to steer clear of that. And the best way to do that is to stay focused on ourselves. So since we're planning these conversations ahead of time, we can take some notes. We can do a little bit of journaling. And there's some areas that are core areas that might make sense to think about when we're evaluating. Are there any boundaries I need to set here? Are there any I need to set there? Common topics include family events and social situations, personal space, if we're living with the person especially, time management, if it's demands on our time, or if we have personal time we want to protect, or work time, and emotional support. Sometimes it's just the way the person talks to us. And I say just, but that can actually be one of the most intense forms of boundary violation is emotional. And that comes through tone of voice, that comes through communication choices. And we can get very specific about what does and doesn't have a place in the relationship moving forward. And when we set down the conditions of the boundary and we say, if this boundary is crossed, and then we fill in the blank, the other side of that could be, I'll be upset on the mild end. If this happens, I'll be upset. On the most extreme end, we have, if this happens, I don't think I can continue having this relationship with you. And there's many, many shades of gray in between those two. But typically, those are our most extreme or our least extreme. Either I can't continue the relationship, or I might be a little upset. So I'm having this ongoing, challenging relationship with a family member, and I plan my boundary setting conversation. We're in a good mood. Everything seems like it's set up for this to go really well. What's probably going to happen? Well, if there's been conflict in this relationship on an ongoing basis, it's probably not going to initially go smooth. Oftentimes, there's going to be some pushback. There's going to be some muscle memory of feeling criticized, even when we're very careful not to criticize in the way we communicate. And so anticipation is a powerful thing. And when our family members are anticipating being attacked, oftentimes they'll respond as if they were attacked, even when they were not. And so this is why disclaimers are very helpful. Sometimes we do the disclaimer at the beginning. I want to talk to you about something. I want you to know I am not criticizing you at all, but I just want to let you know how I feel. Or the disclaimer could come a little bit later after we get the pushback and we say, hey, I really don't want you to feel like I'm criticizing you at all. If it sounded like that, I didn't mean to. I'm just trying to express how things affect me and what the consequences will be if things play out one way or another way. And that's a good way of deconstructing what is fueling the defensiveness. That's going to be feeling attacked, feeling criticized, feeling judged, those kinds of things. So if we can very directly say, hey, I'm not criticizing you, I'm not judging you, something along those lines, we're going to deconstruct that defensiveness. and better to prevent than to try to treat later. But if we forget or if they get defensive anyway, then certainly better than not doing it would be to address it after we kind of get that defensive response. So in handling the pushback, we want to stay consistent and firm on what we're trying to communicate. We don't want it to change just because the family member's pushing back a little bit. And we also want to be gentle and kind, and we want to repeat ourselves because, as I mentioned a moment ago, sometimes there's muscle memory of things going other ways, and we may not even be heard the first time. I would appreciate it if you didn't do this. And the response has nothing to do with that. And then we say, I completely understand how you feel about that, but I just wanted to focus on how I would appreciate it if you didn't do this. All right, so let's assume we've made it through the conversation and it's gone well. The boundary has been accepted and everything seems cool on the surface. What can we expect next? Well, we can expect that the patterns of communication that we've had with a family member have probably been established over years. And there's going to be some inertia, there's going to be some momentum in them staying the same way. But that's okay because we have to look at setting boundaries as training. It's not a one-off light switch. It's much more conditioning, learning, and if we look at it that way, of course, we're not going to learn how to be amazing at anything just hearing the lesson once. So we're going to need to reiterate these boundaries and do what is commonly referred to as holding the boundary for a while. And this is where a lot of people make mistakes. If the boundary isn't respected the first time, it's easy to throw up your hands and say, see, they don't care how I feel. Or to just give up on holding the boundary. They're never going to respect that I don't want to talk about that, and so I'm just going to give up. Neither one is going to lead us to a place where the relationship improves. What we want to do is stay consistent, firm, and not overreact in either direction, and reiterate and repeat. Repetition is the mother of skill when it comes to boundaries. What about if the boundary is changing? What if the relationship strengthens and now the thing that we didn't want to talk about with our brother, for example, we're okay with talking about now? Well, this as well should be thought about usually when we're at home or we're alone and we think about, maybe I should have another conversation. Maybe I should schedule another conversation to adjust the boundary. And it can go the other way. Sometimes the relationship is getting more strained, and so the boundaries need to be more restrictive. Now, either way, it's best done planned ahead of time and not in the heat of the moment. So boundaries can transform a family. When boundaries are introduced that didn't used to be there and they're respected, the relationships can strengthen and can be oftentimes good for the first time ever. And this is an extremely powerful tool that I would not underestimate. And if we follow the guidelines of this video, we can make sure that they're utilized in their most effective way, which include holding the boundary after we set it, communicating with I feel or statements that are centered around our experience and that don't include you. We don't want to say anything like you always, you never. The word you should really be avoided as much as possible when setting boundaries. It should be really isolated to I, even if we're talking about something they do. When you do X, I feel Y, right? Because if we're talking about the way they criticize us and we say, you always do that, that's going to make them feel attacked. If we say, when you said X, Y, or Z about who I'm dating, I felt uncomfortable. Now we're in a place where we're more likely to get some empathy because they're thinking about how they've caused us to feel uncomfortable as opposed to what we're saying about them. So it's very important to talk about our own vulnerability, our own pain, our own challenges that are presented from the boundary being crossed, not who's crossing the boundary and how we feel about them. That's really their lane to decide how they feel about their behaviors and what they want to do about them moving forward. Our lane is to